Hey there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. Before we drift into tonight's tale of the entire story of Marceline the Vampire Queen, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up. Let's begin. Our story starts in a world that feels both familiar and distant. A world that once looked like ours, but after the Mushroom War, it became something very different. The skies no longer held their gentle blue, but were washed with strange colors, heavy with smoke and dust. Cities that once sang with human voices were reduced to hushed skeletons of buildings, cracked and leaning like broken teeth. It was a place where silence had grown thick, where the ruins themselves seemed to whisper of what had been lost. In this broken world, a small child wandered. Her name was Marceline. She was not just any child. Her blood carried strange legacies, tangled together like two rivers that were never meant to meet. On one side, she was human, fragile and soft, bound to the same limits of mortality as the people who had vanished. But on the other side, she was touched by the infernal. Her father was Hunson Abadir, a being of vast and terrible power, the Lord of Evil himself, ruler of the Nightosphere. That legacy was not one of kindness or protection. It was one of hunger, distance, and shadow. Marceline was caught between these two inheritances. She was human enough to bleed, to feel hunger, to ache when she was alone. But she was also more than human. Her very existence hummed with magic, with something deep and unshakable, something that set her apart even when she longed to belong. For a child to carry such weight was no small burden, and in the silence of the ruined world, it was a weight she bore alone. The Mushroom War had not left behind gentle ruins. It had scarred the earth with strange creations, mutants born from radiation, beasts crawling in the cracks, and haunted remnants of a civilization that no longer existed. And it was into this landscape that Marceline took her first steps, searching for food, for comfort, for anything that resembled safety. She was not guided by parents or caretakers. Her father was absent, distant, perhaps indifferent. Her mother's presence is faint in the tapestry of her story, a shadowy thread whose details remain hidden, though it is through her that Marceline's human side shone. Imagine being so small, carrying no more than a stuffed toy in your arms, and facing a world where everything seems larger, harsher, and endlessly hungry. Marceline had Hambo, her beloved teddy bear. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing more than a stitched doll, worn and simple. But to her, it was everything. It was warmth when nights were too cold. It was safety when shadows pressed close. It was memory, even if she was too young to put words to what she was remembering. Hambo was not just cloth and thread. It was the anchor to her humanity. Through the haze of memory, we catch glimpses of these years. We see her walking barefoot across the cracked roads of abandoned cities, stepping past rusted cars with vines curling through their frames. We see her sitting alone at night, gazing up at skies where stars glimmered faintly through the curtains of ash, and always in her hands, Hambo. She was a child learning not just how to survive, but how to carry loneliness without breaking under it. And yet, Marceline was not without strength. Already there was something in her spirit that would not be silenced. She found ways to transform her loneliness into sound, humming soft tunes into the air, shaping melodies from her pain and from her imagination. Music would become her companion long before she ever found friends who could truly stay. It was her first rebellion against silence, a way of saying, I am here. I exist. I feel. It is important to pause and imagine how formative this was Most children are shaped by family, by voices of comfort or discipline. Marceline was shaped by absence, by a father who was present only in the form of a looming reputation, by a mother whose story is faint and quiet, by a world that had collapsed, where there were no playgrounds, no schools, no bustling markets, only ruins and echoes. To grow in such conditions is to become both fragile and unbreakable at once. As the years passed, her father, Hunson Abadir, would step in and out of her life like a shadow across a room. He was not a figure of stability. He was not someone she could cling to when she was afraid. Instead, he was a storm of contradictions, a being who loved her in his own distorted way, but who could not understand the needs of a child. Hunson devoured, he took, he consumed. His relationship with Marceline was threaded with this tension, the deep longing of a child for her father's presence, and the reality of a father who was too bound to his own nature to ever truly stay. This is where Marceline's identity begins to form. She was a child of chaos, born in the ruins of war and raised in the cracks between love and neglect. And yet she was also a child of astonishing resilience. Instead of letting the silence consume her, she filled it with song. Instead of letting abandonment define her, she carried her attachments in small, simple ways in Hambo, in her humming, in her stubbornness to keep moving forward. The ruins of the Mushroom War may have been terrifying, but to Marceline they became her landscape, her home, the backdrop of her earliest memories. Where others would see destruction, she learned to find meaning. Where others would despair, she found ways to express herself. And so, even in her earliest years, she was already becoming who she would one day be. Not just a survivor, but a queen of her own making. Crowned not with jewels or thrones, but with the quiet defiance of a child who refused to vanish in the shadows. There are moments in Marceline's story that feel almost like fragments of a dream, half remembered, blurred at the edges, yet heavy with feeling. One such memory is the bond she shared with Simon Petrikov. Simon was not yet the Ice King then. He was still a man, though his mind was already being tugged and pulled by the cursed crown he had placed upon his head. To Marceline, he was more than a wandering scholar of strange relics. He was the closest thing to a protector she would ever know in those fragile years. Picture them together. A small girl clutching a teddy bear, and an older man with weary eyes trying desperately to hold on to his humanity. Simon carried supplies, offered her food, sang little tunes to keep her spirit steady. And in return, Marceline gave him purpose. She reminded him of why he had to resist the crown's pull for as long as he could. She was his tether to compassion, and he was her brief shelter in a world that had none. Their companionship was not built on grand gestures, but on the simple acts of care that matter most in the wake of devastation. But even this bond could not escape the sorrow of their world. Simon's transformation was slow but inevitable. The crown whispered to him, gnawed at him, filled him with cold and distance. Marceline watched as the man who once cared for her became more unstable, more lost. The pain of losing Simon in this way left a mark on her that would echo through centuries. It taught her that love, even when real, can slip away, that the people we hold on to may vanish before our eyes, not by choice, but by forces greater than either of us can resist. For a child, this is not just sadness. It is a lesson carved deep into the heart. Do not expect permanence. And so Marceline learned to walk alone again, yet she carried Simon's memory like a lantern. Even as the Ice King of later years forgot who she was, even as he became a strange figure of comic tragedy, Marceline never truly forgot the man who once knelt down in the ruins and handed her a can of soup, who wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, who sang to her when the world outside was silent and dangerous. That kind of memory does not fade, even across centuries. The world around her was never still. Time and ooh moved strangely after the Mushroom War. Mutated creatures roamed the land. Magic seeped from old wounds in the earth. Entire kingdoms rose in odd and whimsical ways, sprouting from the remains of humanity's past. For Marceline, each new sight was both fascinating and alien. Candy people, fiery beings, talking animals, the strange fruits of radiation and magic colliding. She did not belong to any of them, yet she observed them with the curious eyes of someone who had already seen too much to be surprised. And within her, the shadow of her father lingered. Hunson Abadir was not gone. He would appear from time to time, sweeping in with his vast power, demanding her attention, confusing her with a mixture of affection and selfishness. For Hunson, love was possession. To him, Marceline was not a child to be nurtured, but a prize to be claimed, an heir to be molded. To Marceline, this was both terrifying and frustrating. She longed for a father who could simply sit with her, share stories, reassure her. Instead, she had a force of nature who could drain life at will, who cared for her but never quite in the way she needed. This tension formed the roots of Marceline's complicated relationship with identity. Was she the daughter of evil, destined to inherit hunger and destruction? Or was she the human child who once curled up with a teddy bear and dreamed of safety? She was both, and neither. Her very existence was a question, one she would spend centuries answering in different ways. Yet even in the uncertainty, her strength continued to shine through. The songs she hummed became more than just idle melodies. They carried stories, fragments of memory, and glimpses of her heart. She would sing about loneliness, about abandonment, about the strangeness of the world around her. Each note was a piece of her soul whispered into the air, and though no one else was there to hear, it mattered. Music was how she anchored herself, how she transformed her pain into something beautiful. If you listen closely to Marceline's later songs, you can still hear echoes of this childhood. Lines that carry longing, chords that bend with sorrow, tones that suggest the quiet nights of her youth. Her music is a living diary, written not with ink, but with sound, and it begins in these years of chaos and war. As Marceline wandered the land, she also began to notice how different she was from the fleeting lives around her. Humans were scarce after the Mushroom War, but those who remained did not last. They aged, they withered, they disappeared. Marceline did not. Even before becoming a vampire, there was something about her demonic blood that stretched her life beyond what others could imagine. She was a child who would become a woman, but she would not fade the way others did. This was both a gift and a curse. For every connection she made, she risked losing it to the passage of time. For every bond she formed, she risked carrying the grief long after the other had gone. The Mushroom War had already taken so much from her. The thought of losing more became part of who she was. It made her wary, hesitant to open up, cautious with her heart. And yet it also made her fiercely loyal when she did choose to love. Those early scars of loss shaped her into someone who would one day fight with everything she had to protect the people who mattered. This is Marceline at her beginning. Not yet the Vampire Queen, not yet the immortal we know, but a child in a broken world. Half demon, half human, wholly alone, yet already creating a language of music, memory, and resilience. The child of chaos and war, whose story would ripple across ages, shaping not only her own fate, but the fate of Ooh itself. Marceline's early years cannot be separated from the silence of the wasteland itself. Silence is often thought of as empty, but for her it was a presence. It pressed against her ears, filled the cracks of ruined streets, hung in the air like mist. When she hummed a tune, it echoed across the emptiness, as if the world itself was listening. Sometimes she might have imagined that the silence was answering back, not in words, but in the strange way shadows seemed to shift, or how wind whistled through broken buildings. To a child, even silence can feel like company when it has been with you long enough. The mushroom war had left scars that were more than physical. Entire landscapes looked haunted. Trees twisted in unnatural shapes. Rivers carried a dull glow. Skies changed color without warning. Marceline walked among these things as if they were normal, because for her, they were. She did not remember the world before. She only knew this strange new one, where candy could walk and fire could speak, where magic seemed to ooze from the soil like sap. What might have terrified others was simply her childhood playground. This is part of what made Marceline who she was. She was not afraid of strangeness. She was born into it, molded by it, and she grew to carry that same sense of mystery within herself. Even so, she craved warmth. She sought it in fleeting encounters with people who passed through her life. Survivors of the war, wanderers, beings born of mutation. Some gave her food, some gave her fear, and most disappeared as quickly as they appeared. But in each fleeting exchange, she learned something. She learned to read expressions, to tell when someone was trustworthy, or when danger lingered in their smile. She learned to fight when she needed to defend herself with sharp teeth and sharper will. Yet she also learned how fragile people could be, and how fragile her own heart was in giving them trust. This is why Hambo remains such a powerful constant. A child needs something steady, and in the absence of steady people, Marceline gave her love to something that could not leave. Every frayed thread of Hambo absorbed her fears and her hopes. To hold him was to remember that she was still a child, even if the world was forcing her to grow faster than she should. Hambo became not only a toy, but a symbol of the innocence she carried despite everything. That bear would travel with her across centuries, pass from hand to hand, return to her when fate allowed, as if it carried the weight of all the memories she could not put down. And while her childhood was marked by loss, it was also marked by the quiet birth of resilience. Marceline discovered that she could feed not on blood, but on the color red itself. This was long before she would become the Vampire Queen, and yet it already set her apart. She could drain the redness from an apple, a tomato, or even a piece of cloth. It was an odd, magical quirk of her half-demon nature. At first, it might have been confusing, even frightening. But over time, it became part of her identity. It meant she did not have to harm to survive, at least not in the way her father might have. It meant she could keep living, quietly and independently, in a way that was all her own. Still, the shadow of Hunson Abadir loomed large. He did not disappear from her story entirely. At times, he would emerge from the nightosphere to visit her, claiming his love in ways that never quite felt like love. Perhaps he brought gifts, or perhaps he demanded her attention, reminding her of the power that flowed in her veins. For Marceline, these visits were both comforting and unsettling. They reminded her that she was not alone in the cosmic sense. She was someone's daughter, linked to a being of terrible might. But they also reminded her that she could not rely on him, not in the way a child longs to rely on a parent. Hunson's love was not soft or patient. It was sharp, selfish, and full of gaps. This conflict planted in her a deep question. Was she destined to become like him? If her father drained souls, would she one day be unable to resist doing the same? Was there something inside her, waiting to awaken, that would strip away the gentleness she held onto. These thoughts followed her like long shadows. And perhaps, in those moments when she pressed Hambo against her chest or whispered songs to herself, she was really whispering reassurances that she could choose who she was, that she was not doomed to follow his path. We see hints of this struggle even in the way she interacted with Simon. He had his own burden, a cursed crown that whispered madness into his mind. Simon and Marceline mirrored one another in their fear of becoming something monstrous. He clung to her to remind himself he was still human. She clung to him to remind herself she was not destined to be cruel. In that companionship lay an unspoken pact, that they could both be more than what their legacies demanded of them. But as Simon slipped further into the ice cane, Marceline had to face solitude once again. This reinforced another lesson, that people change, sometimes in ways you cannot stop, no matter how much you love them. And so, even as a child, she began to carry grief like a second skin. Her songs would later reveal this truth. Beneath the playful tunes and witty words, there was always a chord of sadness, a sense of someone who had lost too much, too soon. The ruins of the Mushroom War were not only Marceline's landscape, but her mirror. She was a child born of conflict, standing among the wreckage of human mistakes. The world was fractured, and so was her heart. And yet both the world and Marceline held seeds of something new. Out of the cracks grew candy kingdoms and fire civilizations. Out of her loneliness grew music and resilience. The brokenness did not end the story. It simply began a new one, stranger and softer than anyone could have predicted. When we think of Marceline as the Vampire Queen, strumming her bass and singing with effortless confidence, it is easy to forget this child. But this child is the root of everything. The survivor wandering ruins, the half-demon girl holding a bear, the daughter of chaos and war who chose, against all odds, to keep singing. To remember this part of her is to understand the heart of her entire story. For every song she would ever sing, every friendship she would ever form, carries within it the echo of this beginning. As Marceline continued to drift through the shattered landscape, she came to understand that survival was not just about finding food or shelter. It was about finding meaning. A child left alone in a broken world can easily fall into despair. Yet Marceline found her meaning in little fragments, in the rhythm of her own footsteps, in the gentle strum of an improvised tune, in the comfort of holding Hambo close. These small acts became rituals, steadying her against the vast emptiness around her. The ruins she wandered were filled with reminders of a life she never had. Rusted swings creaked in playgrounds that no longer held laughter. Grocery stores still bore faded signs, though their shelves were long stripped bare. Skeletons of skyscrapers reached upward, their glass shattered and their concrete bones exposed. To most, these places would seem haunted. But to Marceline, they became stages for her songs, canvases where she painted sound upon silence. She did not run from the emptiness. She embraced it and filled it with her own voice. At times, her father's shadow returned, looming larger than life. Hunson Abadir's presence was like a storm breaking over calm waters. He would arrive with charm and menace entwined, reminding Marceline of her heritage in ways she did not ask for. Sometimes he offered her strange lessons. Other times, he demanded things from her that she could not give. Always there was a distance. Hunson did not know how to be gentle, how to be present in the way a child needed. And so, though Marceline longed for his approval, she learned quickly that his love was not the kind she could rely on. This realization pushed her further toward independence, toward crafting her own identity apart from him. Still, she could not escape the question of who she was. Half human, half demon, she was neither entirely fragile nor entirely indestructible. She belonged nowhere, and yet everywhere she walked became hers, simply because she endured it. Perhaps this is why she would later grow into a figure who did not cling to titles or crowns, even when she bore the name Vampire Queen. Her earliest years had already taught her that belonging was not granted. It was something you made for yourself, piece by piece, song by song. The loneliness of her childhood did not harden her. Instead, it deepened her empathy. When she later encountered people who were outcasts, broken or strange, she recognized them as kin. She had lived as the outsider, the one who did not fit. Rather than reject others for their oddness, she embraced it, because she saw herself reflected in their differences. This is why her friendships were often with those who stood outside the neat lines of kingdoms and hierarchies. She understood what it was to be misunderstood. It is also in these years that we begin to glimpse the tension between her demonic hunger and her human heart. The ability to drain the red from objects was both a gift and a curse. It allowed her to live, but it also marked her as something uncanny. A girl who sipped the redness from an apple was not like the humans who once filled the world. She was something else, and she knew it. Yet rather than let it consume her identity, she turned it into a quirk, even a playful trait. Over time, she would learn to joke about it, to transform what might have been monstrous into something lighter. This resilience, the power to transform darkness into humor or song, became one of her defining strengths. Through all of this, her bond with Simon lingered in her memory like a soft flame. Though he eventually lost himself to the crown's madness, Marceline carried the image of the man who had once cared for her. She carried the memory of canned soup and lullabies, a protection offered freely, in a time when the world had none to give. That memory kept her heart from closing entirely. It was proof that love could exist, however fleeting. And though she would one day struggle with Ice King's forgetfulness, deep down, she never stopped seeing Simon within him. The child Marceline was forged in contradictions, cared for yet abandoned, gifted yet cursed, surrounded by ruins yet singing into the silence. These contradictions shaped her into a person who could survive almost anything. They also explain the depth of her music, the way her songs reach into hidden places of the soul. When she sings of loneliness, it is not just an idea. It is the voice of a child who once walked through empty cities with only a bear to keep her company. When she sings of love, it carries the tremor of someone who has seen love slip away like water through her fingers. The child who once wandered the ruins of a broken world grew older, and with her growth came change. Marceline had learned how to survive, how to carry loneliness, and how to turn sorrow into music. But the path ahead of her was about to shift into something stranger, something that would bind her forever to the very name she carries, the Vampire Queen. By the time Marceline encountered the vampires of Oo, she had already become a wanderer of great resilience. She had seen kingdoms rise from the remnants of humanity, each one colorful, magical, and surreal. Yet these kingdoms were fragile, threatened by shadows that lingered from the war. Among the most dangerous of these shadows were the vampires. They were not like the whimsical creatures of candy or fire. They were predators, carrying an ancient hunger that stretched back long before the Mushroom War. The Vampire King and his court had survived the apocalypse. They roamed the land, feeding on whatever life they could find, spreading fear across fragile civilizations. To most, they seemed unstoppable. They were powerful, immortal, and cruel. But Marceline, still so young compared to them, chose not to run. She chose to fight. And in this choice, her destiny began to unfold. The battles were not easy. Marceline faced each vampire with a mix of courage and desperation. One by one, she confronted them. The Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, the Moon. Each carried a different strength, a different danger. Marceline fought with her wit, her music, and the strange powers that already hummed in her blood. She did not just resist them. She consumed them, draining their powers into herself. With every victory, she grew stronger. With every vampire she defeated, she carried a new piece of their essence inside her. This was not a simple act of heroism. It was survival. Marceline lived in a world where predators hunted freely, and she became the predator that preyed on predators. In doing so, she transformed herself into something more than human, more than demon. She became a vampire. Her battle with the Vampire King was the most defining. The king was not only powerful but ancient, a being who seemed almost eternal. To face him was to stare into the weight of centuries, to confront a hunger that had devoured countless lives. Marceline did not face him with armies or allies. She faced him with the same determination that had guided her since childhood, the refusal to be consumed by anyone else's power. When she defeated the Vampire King, the transformation was complete. She did not simply kill him. She absorbed what he was, carrying his strength within her own body. And with that act, she became the Vampire Queen. But this victory was not a triumph without cost. Becoming a vampire meant stepping into a different kind of existence. She gained immortality, but with it came the ache of eternity. She gained new powers, but they tethered her to a hunger that would never fully fade. She could fly, she could heal, she could endure, but she would also watch others wither while she remained. For Marceline, immortality was not a prize. It was a weight. She had already seen how fragile life could be. Now she was fated to carry her own life far beyond the span of those around her. Every bond she formed would risk being severed by time. Every love, every friendship, every fleeting connection could one day be another memory she had to hold on to alone. And yet this is where Marceline's strength shines most clearly. She did not allow this transformation to strip away her humanity. Instead, she turned it into another melody in her song. She called herself the Vampire Queen. Not as a tyrant, not as a conqueror, but as someone who had endured, someone who had survived predators and claimed her place in the world. The crown she wore was not made of jewels. It was made of scars, victories, and the refusal to let her story be written by others. Even so, she wrestled with the duality within her. Was she still the child who sang to herself in the ruins? Or had she become something else entirely? A creature defined by hunger and power. Marceline carried this question quietly, never letting it silence her, but always aware of it. She had seen her father embody the darker side of power. She knew what it looked like to let hunger consume love, and she was determined not to repeat that pattern. The battles with the vampires shaped not just her powers, but her character. Each victory taught her something about herself. From the Empress, she learned the dangers of manipulation and charm. From the Hierophant, she learned the rigidity of tradition and the cost of breaking it. From the Moon, she learned patience, persistence, and the quiet power of waiting. And from the Vampire King himself, she learned that even the strongest predator can fall when faced with someone who refuses to yield. These lessons did not leave her untouched. They became threads woven to her songs, into the way she carried herself through centuries. They made her wary but also wise. They gave her power, but also the constant reminder that power carries responsibility. And so the child of chaos and war became the Vampire Queen, not by choosing power for its own sake, but by surviving those who would have taken everything from her. In doing so, she carved a space for herself in a world that was still reshaping after destruction. She became a legend, though she never asked to be one. In the quiet aftermath of her battles, Marceline found herself changed. Her reflection was no longer the same. Her fangs, her glowing eyes, her newfound strength, they marked her as something apart from the people of Oo. For some, she became a figure to fear. For others, she was a guardian who had rid the world of predators that no one else could face. Yet to Marceline herself, she was still the same girl, still the child who sang to the silence and clutched Hambo to her chest. But now she had the burden of immortality. To live without end is not just a gift of time. It is a constant reminder that everything around you will change while you remain. Marceline was young when she first felt the strangeness of this truth. She would meet friends, share laughter, maybe even love. And then one day, she would look back and realize that those friends had aged while she had not, that the seasons passed for them but not for her. This realization did not come all at once, but like dawn slowly creeping over the horizon, filling her with both awe and sorrow. The hunger of a vampire also followed her. Marceline's gift of feeding on the color red allowed her to avoid the cruelties of blood drinking, but the temptation of her nature was never completely gone. She felt it lingering in the corners of her mind, whispering that she was not like others, that she could never truly belong. And yet she resisted. Each time she chose an apple, a tomato, or even a pillow dyed crimson instead of blood, she affirmed her humanity. She reminded herself that she was more than her father's legacy, more than her vampire inheritance. She was still Marceline. This balance between her power and her heart became her lifelong rhythm. She did not reject who she was, but she did not surrender to it either. Instead, she made it part of her song. She would strum her bass and sing about hunger, about love, about loneliness. She turned her immortal ache into music that others could feel, even if they could not live it. Through song, she made her eternity bearable. Through song, she shared pieces of herself with a world that might never fully understand her. The title of Vampire Queen came to her not as a throne, but as a symbol. She did not build castles or command armies. Instead, the title reflected her victories, her strength, and her refusal to be prey. It was a crown of survival. Others may have feared her, but in her own mind, it was simply who she had become. She was not trying to rule, only to live authentically in a world where survival often required more than strength. It required resilience of spirit. Still, Marceline felt the shadow of what she had taken in. The powers of the vampires did not vanish when they fell. They lived within her, their voices echoing faintly, their traits becoming part of her. At times, she could feel the weight of their presence, as though she carried pieces of their souls inside her. This was not something she spoke of often, but it lingered in her silences, in the way she would sometimes pause mid-song, as if remembering battles long gone. To carry the essence of her enemies was another kind of loneliness, for it reminded her that her victories came at the cost of absorbing what they once were. Her relationship with time also began to change. In her childhood, days were marked by survival, finding food, seeking shelter, hoping for safety. As a vampire, time stretched differently. Years could pass in the blink of an eye. Centuries could slip through her fingers like sand. This altered her sense of attachment. Sometimes she would grow close to someone, only to drift away, knowing that eventually she would outlive them. Other times, she would isolate herself, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, fearing the grief that always followed closeness. And yet, despite all these struggles, Marceline never lost the core of herself. She was still the girl who sang, still the wanderer who turned emptiness into melody. Her transformation into the Vampire Queen did not strip her of her humanity. Instead, it magnified it. She carried her sorrow more deeply, but also her joy. She loved fiercely, even if it hurt. She laughed loudly, even if it did not last. She created music that touched others, even if they did not know the centuries of loneliness behind each note. The world of Ooh, strange and whimsical as it was, began to know her as something legendary. Stories spread about the Vampire Queen who had defeated the Vampire King, who roamed the land with unmatched power. But the truth was softer than legend. The truth was a woman who still remembered being a lonely child, who still carried Hambo, who still hummed to herself when no one else was listening. Legends often forget the humanity at the center. Marceline never did. And so the birth of the Vampire Queen was not the birth of a tyrant or a conqueror. It was the evolution of a survivor into something eternal. It was the story of a girl who faced predators and chose not only to survive them, but to transform herself into a protector. It was the moment when Marceline stepped fully into her own power and yet carried it with humility, with humor, and with the fragile heart of someone who had known loneliness far too well. There is a curious thing about Marceline's story. Though she became a vampire by defeating the king and his court, she never wore her immortality as a mask of pride. For many, such power might have been an excuse to dominate, to command, to build empires in their image. But for Marceline, eternity was not a ladder to climb. It was a landscape to wander. She drifted through time as she once drifted through the ruins as a child, with no map, no destination, only her music to guide her. The beings of Ooh learned to recognize her presence. Some spoke of her with fear, whispering tales of her sharp fangs and shadowy figure. Others told stories with admiration, grateful for the fall of the Vampire King and the safety she had given them. And yet, Marceline herself did not linger long in any one place. Her heart, though full of love, had been shaped by loss. To stay too close to anyone was to risk the ache of watching them fade. So she often chose the path of solitude, not because she did not care, but because she cared too much. The centuries began to stretch, long ribbons of time unfurling in ways that made memory feel like layers of song stacked upon one another. A year for Marceline was not the same as a year for those around her. For her, it was a single note in a much longer melody. And yet, she never lost her connection to the moment. She still laughed at silly things, still argued with friends, still played her bass with the intensity of someone who felt deeply in the present. This is what made her unique. She was immortal, but she never let eternity strip away the humanity she fought so hard to keep. The powers she carried from the vampires were not only useful, but symbolic. From the fool, she inherited agility and mischief, an echo of playfulness that sometimes surfaced in her teasing nature. From the Empress, she carried a strange awareness of manipulation and charm, a reminder of how dangerous beauty can be when it seeks control. The Hierophant's rigidity lived within her too, though she often rebelled against it, choosing freedom instead of rules. And from the Moon, she carried patience, an endurance that showed in the way she could wait centuries without breaking. The Vampire King's essence was the heaviest of all, a reminder of predation, of hunger, of authority wielded over others. To absorb him was to absorb a lesson in restraint. She carried his power, but chose not to become him. It is in this choice that Marceline's character shines. She could have become a predator. She could have allowed her hunger to rule her. Instead, she chose to transform those instincts into music, into humor, into love. She turned the very things that could have made her monstrous into things that made her more deeply human. It was not that she denied who she was, but that she shaped it into something gentler. Still, the ache of loneliness followed her like a shadow. Immortality has a way of stretching the gaps between people. Friends came and went. Kingdoms rose and fell, yet Marceline remained. She often sang of this ache, not always directly, but through metaphors that revealed her longing. To those who listened closely, her songs were diaries of centuries, fragments of a soul that had carried too much. The idea of being queen was never a title she asked for. It was something the world gave her, something that stuck because she had outlasted and overcome. Yet in her own mind, she was not ruling anyone. She was simply existing. Her reign was not over lands or people, but over her own identity. She was queen of her own survival, of her ability to take sorrow and turn it into melody. That is what made her powerful. As the years went on, Marceline's relationship with her father complicated further. Hunson Abadir was proud of her power, proud that she had become something formidable. But pride was not the same as love. His approval never filled the gaps she carried inside. She still longed for the kind of care Simon had once given her, the kind of warmth she had only glimpsed in fleeting moments. Her father could not give her that, and so Marceline remained independent, both strengthened and burdened by the knowledge that true nurturing was something she had to find elsewhere. The irony of her immortality was that it did not make her invincible to pain. In fact, it sharpened her awareness of it. When you live forever, grief becomes a companion, but so too does joy. Marceline experienced both in endless cycles, and instead of letting the sorrow bury her, she wove it into the music that defined her. Her voice carried not just notes, but centuries of lived emotion. It carried hunger, laughter, longing, and resilience all at once. In these ways, the birth of the Vampire Queen was less a single moment than a series of transformations. It began with the fall of the Vampire King, but it continued through the centuries of choices Marceline made afterward. Each choice to love despite loss, to laugh despite sorrow, to sing despite silence, became part of her crown. And though immortality stretched endlessly ahead, Marceline continued to carry herself with the same stubborn tenderness she had as a child in the ruins. When we picture Marceline in these years after her transformation, we see her suspended between two worlds. On one hand, she was feared as a creature of the night, a predator who had absorbed the essence of the most powerful vampires in Oo. On the other, she was still the girl who found comfort in music, who sang to ease the ache of loneliness. This duality became her truth. She was both a legend whispered in the shadows and a soul yearning for a simple connection. The landscapes of Oo reflected this tension. Magic had seeped into the world after the Mushroom War, creating lands of candy, ice, and flame. Marceline wandered through them like a traveler without a map, sometimes joining, sometimes withdrawing, always curious yet cautious. She could laugh with new friends one day and retreat into solitude the next. For her, connection was precious but fragile. She knew from experience how easily bonds could break, how quickly laughter could turn into silence. So when she opened her heart, she did it with the weight of centuries behind her. The powers she had absorbed were not simply weapons. They became metaphors for the lessons she carried. The fool's agility reminded her that even immortals must adapt and play. The Empress's charm reminded her of how dangerous control can be when disguised as affection. The Hierophant's stubborn traditions reminded her that freedom mattered more than following the rules of others. The moon's endurance gave her patience, the ability to wait without despairing. And the Vampire King, whose presence lingered most heavily, taught her restraint to hold power without letting it consume her. These lessons did not erase her pain, but they gave her resilience. When she picked up her bass and let her voice fill the air, the world around her listened, even if it did not fully understand. Her music carried the weight of her victories, her losses, her endless wandering. She could sing a playful tune that made others laugh, and yet within it, there was always an echo of sorrow, a reminder that behind every smile was a history of silence. Marceline's immortality also gave her a unique perspective on time. She began to see patterns repeating themselves. Kingdoms rose and fell, leaders came and went. Conflicts flared only to fade into memory. Through it all, she remained, bearing witness to the cycles of Ooh. This gave her a kind of quiet wisdom, though she rarely presented herself as a sage. Instead, she carried her knowledge in her songs, in subtle hints and quiet lyrics, letting her music speak where words often failed. There were times when she wondered if she had done the right thing by taking in the powers of the vampires. The weight of their essences sometimes pressed against her heart, reminding her that her survival had come at the cost of absorbing those she defeated. Yet in the stillness, she would remind herself that she had protected others, that her actions had given the world a chance to grow free of their hunger. This thought did not erase the heaviness, but it gave it meaning. Her father, Hunson. Abadir, ever looming, viewed her transformation as proof of her strength. To him, the fact that she had conquered the Vampire King was something to be proud of, but Marceline did not see it that way. For her, it was not pride that defined the moment, but survival. It was not about proving herself to her father, but about protecting herself from a world that had already taken too much. In this difference lay the heart of her independence. She did not measure her worth by his approval. She measured it by the choices she made and the songs she carried within her. The crown of Vampire Queen was never about ruling. It was about existing with dignity in a world that often misunderstood her. Marceline wore the title like a reminder, not of conquest, but of endurance. She had faced predators and walked away stronger. She had taken in their powers, but she had not let those powers define her. Instead, she shaped them into part of her identity, weaving them into the greater melody of her life. And so, the story of Marceline's transformation is not just a tale of battles and victories. It is the story of a soul who carried the scars of childhood, who stepped into immortality with caution, who refused to let hunger or power erase her humanity. She became the Vampire Queen not because she sought the crown, but because the world gave it to her when she refused to be consumed. When we listen to her music, when we hear her voice tremble with sadness or burst with laughter, we are hearing more than just a song. We are hearing the echoes of these early years, the battles that reshaped her, the loneliness she endured, the choices she made. Every note carries the story of the child who survived the ruins and the woman who became eternal. To understand Marceline fully, we must turn to the bonds that shaped her life. For someone immortal, relationships are both a blessing and a burden. Each connection she formed was like a spark in the dark, offering warmth, laughter, and meaning. Yet each also carried the risk of fading, slipping away with the slow passage of time. For Marceline, bonds were never light or casual. They were profound, shaping her music, her choices, and the very way she understood herself. The earliest and most important bond of her childhood was with Simon Petrikov. Long before he became the Ice King, Simon was a scholar, a man fascinated by relics and history. After the Mushroom War, when the world was at its weakest, Simon stumbled across Marceline. She was just a child, fragile and frightened, clutching Hambo in her arms. Simon, burdened by the cursed crown that already tugged at his mind, chose to protect her. In a world that had lost nearly all traces of kindness, he became her guardian, her companion, and in many ways, her only family. The tenderness between them was quiet but powerful. Simon carried her through ruins, offered her food, and shielded her from danger. In return, Marceline gave him something equally valuable, a reason to resist the crown. The voices of madness called to him, whispering of cold and control. But Marceline's presence reminded him of his humanity, reminded him that he still had a choice. She gave him purpose, and he gave her safety. Together they created a fragile oasis in the wasteland. Yet even this bond was not safe from sorrow. Slowly, Simon's mind began to fade. The crown's whispers grew louder, its pull more irresistible. Marceline could see the man she loved as a father figure slipping away. To watch someone you depend on lose themselves is a grief unlike any other. It is not a sudden loss, but a slow unraveling, each day showing a little more of what has been taken. Marceline carried this grief deep within her, and it shaped her for centuries to come. It taught her that even the strongest bonds could break, not always by choice, but by forces beyond control. As time passed, Marceline formed new relationships. Some were fleeting friendships, others were loves that burned brightly before fading. Each bond left a mark. She laughed with friends in distant kingdoms, played songs that stitched her closer to others, and sometimes argued with the same intensity that she loved. Her connections were always vivid, full of passion and honesty. But the shadow of impermanence never left her. She always knew, whether consciously or not, that she would likely outlast those she loved. This is what made her friendship so precious. Every moment mattered more because she knew how fragile it was. When Marceline laughed with someone, it was not just laughter. It was her way of pouring centuries of loneliness into one brief joy. When she argued, it was not just frustration. It was the fear of losing another bond, the fear of being left behind again. To love and lose was her rhythm, and she sang it into every note of her music. Her romances, too, were painted with this duality of joy and sorrow. Marceline was not afraid to love, but her loves were often complicated. They reflected her own struggles with identity, her own fears of abandonment. To give her heart to someone was to hand them a piece of eternity, knowing they might not be able to carry it with her. Some of these relationships ended in heartbreak, others in simple drifting apart, but none of them were meaningless. Each one taught her more about herself, about what it meant to care for others while living with the weight of immortality. And yet, despite the pain of broken bonds, Marceline never stopped seeking connection. She never allowed her losses to turn her cold. This is what made her extraordinary. Many immortals in stories choose isolation, building walls around their hearts to shield themselves from the ache of time. Marceline did the opposite. She kept opening herself again and again to the possibility of love and friendship. Each time she was hurt, she sang it into her music, turning heartbreak into melodies that others could share. Her songs became more than entertainment. They became her diary, her confessions, her way of preserving the people she had loved and lost. To listen to Marceline sing is to hear centuries of bonds layered together, Simon's fading voice, the laughter of old friends, the sigh of past lovers. Each chord carries memory, Each lyric holds a story. Through music, Marceline refused to let her bonds die completely. She kept them alive, even if only in echoes. This is the paradox of Marceline. She was immortal, but her heart was deeply mortal. She could endure the centuries, but she could not harden herself against the pain of connection. Her bonds healed her when she was at her loneliest, and they broke her when they were lost. Yet she chose, again and again, to seek them. To love, even knowing loss, was inevitable. This choice is what makes her story so profoundly human, even as she floated above the earth with fangs and glowing eyes. Among all her relationships, the bond with Simon never left her heart. Even centuries later, when Simon had become the Ice King and no longer remembered who she was, Marceline still carried the memory of the man who once held her hand through the ruins. It was a wound that never healed fully, a reminder that the people who matter most can change into strangers. Sometimes, when the Ice King stumbled into her life with his rambling and nonsense, Marceline's frustration boiled over. But beneath the frustration was sorrow. She wasn't angry because he was annoying. She was angry because she remembered who he used to be. Every foolish word he spoke reminded her of the gentle guardian who had been lost to madness. This grief shaped how Marceline approached other bonds. She became wary of losing people again, of watching them slip through her fingers. At times she would test those closest to her, pushing them away to see if they would come back. It wasn't cruelty. It was fear disguised as stubbornness. She needed to know if those she cared for would fight to stay, or if they would drift away like so many before them. This pattern made her relationships intense, sometimes stormy, but always honest. She did not know how to love lightly. She loved with the weight of centuries pressing behind her, and that weight made her both vulnerable and fiercely protective. There were friendships that steadied her, offering brief relief from her burdens. Some companions laughed at her jokes, joined in her songs, or simply sat with her in silence. These small acts meant more than anyone realized. To Marceline, even a fleeting moment of genuine connection was a treasure. She had lived through too many empty years not to value the warmth of company. And yet she always held the knowledge that these friends might not stay, and that time might eventually pull them away. Her romances reflected this same push and pull between intimacy and fear. Marceline's heart was passionate, and she gave herself fully when she cared for someone. But immortality complicated love. To her, a decade could feel like a passing season, while to her partner, it might feel like half a lifetime. This imbalance created tension and sometimes heartbreak. Yet Marceline never stopped trying. Each love, no matter how brief, added another layer to her songs, another shade to her emotional palette. Her music was not only a reflection of love, but also a way of keeping people close. When she sang about someone, it was as if she was preserving them in melody, capturing the essence of their bond so that it would never fade completely. In this way, her songs became memorials as much as confessions. Even when people left her life, they remained in her music, their presence immortalized in sound. But not all bonds ended in sorrow. Some healed her in ways she never expected. When she found someone who truly stayed, who accepted both her light and her shadows, she felt pieces of her heart mend. These relationships reminded her that loss was not the whole story, that connection could bring joy even if it carried risk. It was in these healing bonds that Marceline's laughter shone brightest, unguarded and genuine, echoing against the centuries of silence she had endured. Still, the tension never vanished entirely. Every bond carried both healing, and breaking within it. For Marceline, this was simply the truth of existence. To love was to risk loss. To be immortal was to know that risk more intimately than most. Yet she chose love anyway, again and again. Her courage lay not only in fighting vampires or facing danger, but in continuing to open her heart despite all it had suffered. This is why Marceline's songs resonate so deeply. They are not just about vampires, magic, or kingdoms. They are about the raw universal truth of connection, how it can heal us, how it can break us, and how we choose to keep seeking it anyway. When she strummed her bass and sang lines of longing or defiance, she was not just telling her own story. She was telling the story of anyone who has loved and lost, of anyone who has felt the fear of abandonment and chosen to try again. Marceline's bonds are the quiet thread that runs through her entire story. They explain her vulnerability, her humor, her bursts of anger, and her gentle moments of care. They explain why she sometimes hides behind sarcasm, and why she sometimes bears her soul through music. They explain the complexity of a character who is both immortal and deeply, achingly human. To truly understand the depth of Marceline's bonds, we must linger a while longer with Simon. For even as centuries passed and the world rebuilt itself into strange kingdoms, that early companionship never left her heart. When Simon became the Ice King, their roles shifted painfully. No longer could he protect her. No longer could he remember the moments that had bound them together in the ruins. And yet, Marceline carried those memories for both of them. She became the guardian of their shared past, holding it safe in her songs, even when he could not. When the Ice King appeared in her life, clumsy and rambling, Marceline's reactions were layered. She might roll her eyes, banter with him, or even shout in frustration. But underneath was always the echo of sorrow. For her, every nonsense word was a reminder of what had been lost. For him, every visit was just another odd interaction. This imbalance was painful. Yet Marceline never truly cast him aside. She kept him near in one way or another, because letting go of Simon entirely was something she could never do. Her songs about him reveal this most clearly. In them, she doesn't just sing of loss. She sings of love, a love that survives even when the person is gone, even when they no longer remember who you are. Through her music, Marceline stitched Simon's humanity into the fabric of Ooh, preserving him in ways he could not preserve himself. This act of remembrance was both healing and heartbreaking. It gave her strength, but it also reminded her of the weight she carried alone. Beyond Simon, Marceline's bonds with others followed the same rhythm of healing and breaking. She drifted through the kingdoms of Ooh, sometimes forming friendships with beings far removed from her own nature. Candy folk, magical creatures, even those who feared her at first came to see her as more than a vampire. When she opened up, people discovered her humor, her tenderness, her music. These friendships were not always long-lived, but they mattered. They reminded Marceline that even an immortal could still belong, if only for a while. Yet belonging was never simple. Immortality placed distance between Marceline and those she loved. She could not age with them, could not share the slow passage of life in the same way. To her, decades were only a fraction of her story. To her friends, they were everything. This difference created misunderstandings, sometimes even resentment. Marceline often struggled to explain the weight she carried because how could someone with a single lifetime understand what it meant to live many? This gap made her bonds both precious and fragile, always balancing between closeness and distance. Her romances reflected this same delicate balance. When Marceline fell in love, she did so wholeheartedly. She gave her heart fully, knowing the risk it carried. Some of these loves burned brightly, but faded quickly. Others lasted longer, marked by both tenderness and conflict. Marceline's intensity often made these relationships stormy, filled with moments of passion and moments of distance. Yet even in heartbreak, she did not regret loving. Each relationship became another song, another way of expressing the fullness of her heart. It is here that we see the unique strength of Marceline's spirit. Many immortals in stories are portrayed as cold, detached, weary of the endless cycles of love and loss. Marceline could have chosen that path. She could have walled herself off, deciding that connection was not worth the pain. But she never did. She continued to open her heart even after centuries of grief. She continued to love even when she knew loss was inevitable. This choice was not naive, it was courageous. To embrace love, knowing it will break you, is one of the bravest acts of all. Her music was the bridge between her immortality and her humanity. Through her songs, she processed the complexity of her bonds. She turned her arguments into lyrics, her heartbreak into chords, her laughter into playful refrains. Anyone who listened closely could hear the truth beneath the surface. Her songs were not just performances. They were confessions, memories, and love letters to the people who had shaped her life. One of Marceline's most profound qualities is the way she carried others with her. Even when bonds broke, she did not erase them. She remembered. She immortalized them in her music, in her stories, in the quiet silences when their absence pressed against her heart. In this way, she transformed loss into legacy. The people she loved were never truly gone because she carried them forward through the centuries, stitched into her melodies. And so, Marceline's story of bonds is not one of simple tragedy. It is the story of someone who chose again and again to open herself to connection, even when it hurt. Her life was not defined only by grief, but by the courage to love despite grief. These bonds healed her when she was at her lowest, and they broke her when they were lost. But without them, she would not be Marceline. Without them, she would not have her music, her humor, or her enduring humanity. To see how bonds shaped Marceline most clearly, we can look at the way she interacted with people she trusted enough to let her guard down. With most of the world, she often hid behind sarcasm or humor. It was a shield, a way to keep her heart safe from disappointment. But when someone truly mattered, when she let them close, the shield fell away. Her vulnerability showed in those quiet moments, in the songs that slipped from her lips, in the way she admitted fears she rarely spoke aloud. It was this vulnerability that made her bond so powerful. When Marceline argued with someone she cared about, it was never shallow. Every conflict came from the depth of her feelings. She could be fiery, defensive, even hurtful in the moment. But it was because she feared losing them. It was because she cared so deeply that the thought of distance felt unbearable. And when reconciliation came, when forgiveness flowed between her and the people she loved, the relief was overwhelming. For an immortal who had lost so much, every healed bond felt like a miracle. Her music gives us the clearest window into these cycles of breaking and healing. In her songs, she poured not just her emotions, but the very essence of her relationships. When she felt abandoned, the words cut sharp. When she felt love, the melodies glowed with tenderness. When she felt conflict, the rhythm pulsed with tension. To listen to Marceline was to hear the living history of her bonds, preserved not in books or monuments, but in chords and lyrics that could be carried on the wind. These bonds also gave her a deeper understanding of others. Having lived through abandonment, she could recognize it in those around her. Having endured loss, she could empathize with others who carried grief. This made her not only a singer of her own story, but a mirror for others. People who listened to her music often felt that she was singing their story too, that her pain reflected their own, that her hope gave them courage. In this way, Marceline's bonds extended far beyond the people she directly loved. Through music, she created invisible bonds with countless others who resonated with her songs. And yet, despite the reach of her music, Marceline never stopped longing for closeness. Immortality gave her endless time, but what she desired was intimacy, the presence of someone who stayed. When she found it, even briefly, it transformed her. Her laughter grew brighter, her songs warmer, her heart lighter. These moments of joy were not erased by the knowledge that they might end. Instead, they became more precious because of it. She cherished them with the full awareness of how fragile they were. Perhaps this is the truest measure of Marceline's humanity. She did not let the inevitability of loss stop her from loving. She did not let centuries of grief harden her into isolation. She chose again and again to risk her heart, to form bonds that healed her, even when they broke her too, to sing of love, even when it ended, to seek connection, even when loneliness seemed inevitable. This is what makes her more than just a vampire queen. It makes her one of the most human souls in the land of Ooh. If we step back and look at her story through this lens, we see that every major moment in her life is tied to bonds. Simon saved her in her childhood and gave her strength, even when he could not stay. Her father left her with wounds that shaped her resilience. Friends and lovers taught her to laugh, to argue, to reconcile, and to keep opening her heart. Each bond was both a gift and a test, both a healing light and a breaking weight. For Marceline, bonds were not just part of life. They were the essence of it. They gave her music its depth. They gave her immortality its meaning. Without them, her story would be one of endless drifting. With them, it became a story of love, grief, and the courage to keep singing. Among the many relationships that shaped Marceline's centuries, none shines quite as brightly or burns quite as hot as her bond with Princess Bubblegum. Their story is not simple. It is woven with conflict and care, distance and closeness, misunderstandings and confessions. To speak of Marceline and Bubblegum is to speak of two forces that seem opposite, yet endlessly drawn toward one another. Bubblegum, with her precision and order, was a being of science and responsibility. She carried the weight of her kingdom, the Candy People, on her shoulders at all times. Her choices were careful, deliberate, often cold in their logic. Marceline, by contrast, lived in freedom. She wandered without rules, sang her emotions into the night, and carried chaos within her soul. On the surface, they could not have been more different. Yet beneath those differences, there was a resonance, a recognition that each carried something the other needed. Their early interactions were often marked by tension. Marceline teased, provoked, even sang songs that seemed designed to sting. Bubblegum responded with sharp words, sometimes cold, sometimes defensive. But behind these exchanges was something unspoken. Anger is rarely born from indifference. Their words carried the energy of people who cared deeply but did not yet know how to express it. Marceline's song, "I'm Just Your Problem," reveals the heart of the struggle. In it, she bears herself with raw honesty, accusing Bubblegum of pushing her away, of treating her like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The lyrics cut sharp, but beneath them is pain, the pain of someone who longs to be seen and accepted by the one she cannot stop caring for. To sing such words was not just performance. It was confession. It was Marceline telling Bubblegum and the world that she wanted closeness. that she wanted to matter. Bubblegum, for her part, struggled with a vulnerability. Her role as princess demanded control, demanded distance. To admit her feelings for Marceline meant risking not only her heart, but also the stability of her kingdom. And yet, despite her resistance, her actions betrayed her emotions. The way she looked at Marceline, the way she softened in her presence, the way their arguments carried the weight of love unspoken, all of it pointed to a bond deeper than friendship. For centuries, their relationship ebbed and flowed. Sometimes they drifted apart, carried by their differences. Sometimes they clashed, their arguments loud and painful. And yet they always returned to one another. This return was not coincidence. It was inevitability. No matter how far they strayed, their stories always seemed to circle back, as if the world itself knew they belonged together. Marceline's songs often revealed what words could not. She sang of heartbreak, of longing, of frustration. These songs were not abstract. They were windows into her bond with Bubblegum. Even when she tried to mask her feelings with sarcasm or playfulness, her music betrayed the depth of her emotions. Bubblegum may have been slow to admit her own feelings, but Marceline's music laid them bare note by note, lyric by lyric. Their bond was not simply romantic tension. It was symbolic of the balance between chaos and order. Marceline embodied freedom, raw emotion, and rebellion. Bubblegum embodied control, responsibility, and structure. Together, they represented the meeting of two forces that seemed opposite, but were in truth complementary. Where Bubblegum offered stability, Marceline offered release. Where Marceline offered vulnerability, Bubblegum offered steadiness. Each needed the other, even if they struggled to admit it. In their arguments, we see the push and pull of these forces. Marceline longed for closeness, for acceptance without conditions. Bubblegum longed for security, for assurance that love would not disrupt her duty. Their clashes were painful because they reflected their deepest fears. Marceline feared being abandoned, treated as a burden. Bubblegum feared losing control, risking everything she had built. Yet beneath these fears was love, quiet and undeniable. Over time, these barriers began to crack. Small moments revealed tenderness, a shared laugh, a lingering glance, a willingness to listen when it mattered most. In these moments, we see the healing of old wounds, the slow work of trust being rebuilt. Their relationship was never about perfection. It was about persistence, about choosing to come back to one another again and again, even after conflict. And so as we begin to explore Marceline and Bubblegum's bond, we step into a story of love that was always there, waiting beneath layers of pride, fear, and responsibility. A story of two souls who mirrored one another's weaknesses and strengths, and who found in each other the courage to be vulnerable. When we look closely, their differences become a kind of poetry. Bubblegum's mind was sharp as glass, calculating and precise, always planning for the survival of her people. Marceline's heart was wild and open, untamed by rules, forever seeking authenticity. Together they clashed like fire and water, yet also nourished one another like earth and rain. Their arguments were loud because their affection was louder still. Their conflicts carried weight because what bound them together could never be broken entirely. One of the most telling aspects of their relationship was the way they tested one another. Marceline tested Bubblegum's boundaries with teasing, with songs that pierced past her walls. Bubblegum tested Marceline's patience with her endless responsibilities, with her reluctance to speak openly of her feelings. These tests, though painful at times, revealed the strength of their connection. They both needed to know the other could withstand the storm, and again, they discovered that they could. moments of tenderness shone brightest in the quiet spaces between battles and duties. There were times when Marceline dropped her playful mask and allowed her vulnerability to surface. In those moments, Bubblegum softened, her logical exterior giving way to genuine care, whether it was through the simple act of listening or through the warmth of her presence. Bubblegum revealed that beneath her crown was a heart that beat for Marceline. Their story was never about sudden declarations or easy confessions. It was about slow growth, the careful weaving together of two very different souls. For Marceline, every small gesture meant the world: a smile, a touch, the willingness to stay even when arguments flared. For Bubblegum, every step toward vulnerability was a leap of courage. Together, they built something fragile but enduring, something that spoke not only of love, but of patience, forgiveness, and resilience. Marceline's music once again played a central role. When words failed, her songs carried the truth. Even Bubblegum, who valued reason over emotion, could not deny the honesty in Marceline's lyrics. Each note bypassed logic and went straight to the heart. In this way, Marceline spoke to Bubblegum in a language she could not argue against. Music became the bridge between science and chaos, between order and feeling. As the years unfolded, the tension between them began to ease. What once was sharp conflict softened into playful banter, a rhythm of closeness that carried both comfort and intimacy. They still argued, as all who love deeply do, but their arguments no longer carried the same weight of threat. They became part of the music of their bond, a dissonance that resolved into harmony. For the people of Ooh, the relationship between Marceline and Bubblegum was not always visible. Much of their intimacy was carried in small gestures, in private words, in the spaces between grand adventures. Yet for those who looked closely, the truth was undeniable. Their eyes lingered on one another. Their voices softened in each other's presence. Even when separated, they moved as though pulled by an unseen thread that always drew them back together. In many ways, their love was an act of defiance against the world around them. In a land built from the ruins of apocalypse, where kingdoms rose and fell like shifting tides, their bond was a statement of persistence. It said that even in the face of chaos and war, love could endure. Even in the face of duty and immortality, vulnerability could flourish. Their relationship was not perfect, but it was real, and in its reality it offered hope. The arc of Marceline and Bubblegum's bond is a testament to the complexity of love itself. Love is not always easy or smooth. It can be jagged, filled with conflict, tangled with fear. But it is also healing, steady, and luminous. Marceline and Bubblegum showed that love does not erase differences, but embraces them, weaving them into something stronger. Their relationship was the union of chaos and order, of vulnerability and responsibility, of song and silence. And perhaps most importantly, their bond gave Marceline something she had longed for since childhood, a partner who stayed. Bubblegum, despite her flaws and her duties, chose again and again to return to Marceline. That choice was everything. For someone who had watched Simon slip away, who had endured centuries of drifting friendships and fleeting loves, the constancy of Bubblegum was a kind of healing she had never known before. There were times when their bond bent under the weight of misunderstanding. Bubblegum's devotion to her kingdom sometimes left Marceline feeling neglected, as though she came second to duty. For someone who had known abandonment as a child, this struck a painful chord. Marceline wanted to believe she was chosen for who she was, not placed on a shelf when responsibility called louder. Her songs reflected this ache, full of longing to be seen, to be valued, not as a problem, but as a person. Bubblegum, on the other hand, carried her own struggles. She was not heartless, but she was careful. Every decision she made rippled through her people, and she bore that weight constantly. To open her heart to Marceline fully meant risking a crack in the structure she had built, risking distraction, risking vulnerability in a world where stability mattered. Yet despite all this, she could not turn away. The very chaos that frightened her and Marceline was also the very spark that drew her close. What makes their story so captivating is the way it unfolded over time, not in grand gestures, but in countless small moments, a simple act of trust, a shared glance that lasted just a beat too long, a willingness to forgive after an argument. These were the threads that wove their bond stronger and stronger until finally it became undeniable. Even their conflicts revealed the depth of their love. Marceline's fiery words and Bubblegum's sharp retorts were not the marks of indifference, but of care. You do not argue with someone who means nothing to you. Their arguments were the battles of two people who mattered deeply to each other, who were learning, slowly and painfully, how to meet in the middle. Music remained the quiet pulse of their bond. Marceline could express in a song what Bubblegum found difficult to say aloud. When Bubblegum listened, she was forced to set aside her logic and hear the raw truth of Marceline's heart. These moments were transformative. They pulled down walls, broke silences, and replaced them with something more honest. It was through music that Marceline asked to be loved for who she was, and through listening that Bubblegum finally began to understand the depth of that request. Over the years, their love became something steady. The sharp edges of their differences softened into balance. Bubblegum learned that duty did not have to mean emotional distance, and Marceline learned that vulnerability could exist without the constant fear of abandonment. Together, they carved out a space where both chaos and order could live side by side. This love was more than personal. It was symbolic. In the world of Ooh, where kingdoms rose from candy, fire, and ice, Marceline and Bubblegum embodied the blending of contrasts. They showed that even in a fractured world, harmony could be found not by erasing differences, but by embracing them. Their relationship was a song of opposites, turning discord into melody. And perhaps the most powerful part of this story is that it was never about perfection. They were not flawless lovers. They argued, they stumbled, they hurt each other at times, but they always returned. That return was the proof of their bond. It was not fragile glass that shattered at the first crack, but living wood that bent and grew stronger with every storm. For Marceline, Bubblegum's presence was a healing answer to centuries of loss. She was someone who did not slip away like Simon, who did not fade like mortal friends, who did not disappear into memory. She stayed. And in staying, she gave Marceline something no power or title could provide, the comfort of knowing that she was not alone. For Bubblegum, Marceline gave her permission to be vulnerable. She reminded her that love was not a weakness. The chaos could be just as necessary as order. Marceline was her reminder that life was not only about calculation and stability, but also about laughter, passion, and song. In loving Marceline, Bubblegum rediscovered parts of herself she had long buried beneath the weight of her crown. Their story is one of the most tender threads in Adventure Time because it unfolds with the quiet truth of real love. It is not love written as fantasy, but love written as endurance. A love that argues, forgives, drifts, returns, and ultimately endures across centuries. It is the kind of love that feels lived in, the kind of love that carries the marks of time and still shines brighter for it. When the world saw their bond fully realized, it felt less like a sudden spark and more like the unveiling of something that had always been there. Their love was not new. It had been written in every argument, every song, every glance they shared across centuries. What changed was not its existence, but their willingness to claim it openly. For Marceline, this was a triumph of vulnerability. To love Bubblegum openly was to admit, without disguise, that she longed to be chosen and to stay chosen. It was to let go of the fear that she was just a problem, to trust that she could be accepted fully, chaos and all. For someone who had spent so much of her life bracing for abandonment, this was the bravest act of all. For Bubblegum, it was a triumph of surrender. She had carried her kingdom like a weight for longer than anyone could imagine, convinced that her crown required her to lock away her heart. But with Marceline, she discovered that love was not a distraction from her duty. It was a source of strength. In Marceline's laughter, she found relief from her burdens. In Marceline's music, she found honesty that balanced her own silence. By choosing Marceline, she chose a fuller life, one that embraced both responsibility and joy. Together, they offered each other something neither could have found alone. Marceline offered Bubblegum freedom from perfection, a reminder that flaws are not failures, but part of being alive. Bubblegum offered Marceline consistency, the assurance that she was not alone in her immortality, that someone would walk beside her even as the centuries turned. Their bond also reflected something larger, the resilience of love itself in a world shaped by war and chaos. U was born from the ruins of destruction, yet within it bloomed kingdoms, friendships, and love stories. Marceline and Bubblegum embodied this resilience. Their relationship proved that even after the deepest losses, even after centuries of drifting and conflict, love could endure. It could rise from ashes and become something steady, something luminous. When we imagine them together, it is not only in moments of passion or conflict. It is in the quiet gestures, Bubblegum adjusting her crown while watching Marceline strum her bass, Marceline teasing Bubblegum until she finally laughs, her composure breaking into something real. Two immortals standing side by side, one bound to science, the other to song, both finding in each other the balance they had been searching for all along. Their love was not a fairy tale with a clear beginning and end. It was a song that unfolded across centuries, with the verses of heartbreak, choruses of reconciliation, and refrains that carried the weight of memory. It was imperfect, and in that imperfection lay its beauty. Because love that endures through storms, through silence, through the heavy march of time, that is the kind of love that feels most real. For Marceline, to love Bubblegum was to heal parts of herself that had remained raw since childhood. It was proof that not every bond must break, that not every love must end in loss. For Bubblegum, to love Marceline was to learn that vulnerability is not weakness, but strength, that order can make space for chaos without crumbling. Their bond, seen from a distance, may look like opposites colliding. But from within, it was two hearts finding harmony in contrast. It was a melody where one voice carried freedom and the other carried responsibility, and together they created music neither could have made alone. And so the story of Marceline and Princess Bubblegum stands as one of the most meaningful arcs in Adventure Time. It is not just a romance, it is a meditation on endurance, on vulnerability, on the courage to love despite fear. It reminds us that the most powerful connections are not the ones without flaws, but the ones that persist through them. Immortality is often spoken of as a gift, to live forever, to never fear death, to see centuries unfold like chapters in a book. But for Marceline, immortality was never so simple. It was not a crown of glory, it was a weight. pressing against her shoulders with every passing year. It was the knowledge that no matter how much she loved, no matter how deeply she connected, time would always take others away while she remained. At first, the weight revealed itself slowly. In the beginning, immortality felt like survival. She had defeated the Vampire King, absorbed his essence, and stepped into a life that stretched far beyond what mortals could dream of. For a while, this felt like freedom. Marceline wandered through without fear of aging, without fear of sickness or frailty. She could explore, laugh, and play her songs while kingdoms rose and fell around her. She could stand on mountaintops and watch generations come and go, knowing she would still be standing when the world looked different again. But immortality is not only about endurance, it is about repetition. It is about watching the same stories unfold again and again in different shapes, while you hold the memories of all that came before. Marceline began to notice how every friendship, every romance, every moment of closeness was temporary. Not because people wanted to leave her, but because time would carry them away. Mortals aged, kingdoms collapsed, even beings of magic changed in ways she did not. She stayed, and they slipped into memory. This created a kind of distance. When Marceline laughed with friends, she laughed fully, but deep in her heart she knew that the laughter might one day echo only in her memory. When she fell in love, she gave her whole heart, but she also carried the quiet knowledge that she would likely outlive the one she loved. This knowledge was not a wall that stopped her, but a shadow that followed her, making every joy bittersweet. Hambo, her beloved stuffed bear, became a symbol of this weight. A simple toy, worn and stitched, yet to Marceline it was more than fabric. It was memory. It was a thread connecting her back to childhood, back to innocence in the ruins of the Mushroom War. Every time she held Hambo, she remembered what she had lost and what she had endured. He was not just a keepsake. He was her anchor. In a life where centuries blurred together, Hambo remained steady, a reminder that she was still the same soul who once wandered alone with nothing but a toy in her arms. Music, too, became her way of carrying immortality. Each song was not only an expression of her feelings, but a preservation of her experiences. Through music, Marceline captured moments that might otherwise slip into the endless stream of time. A heartbreak became a lyric, a friendship became a melody, an argument became a rhythm. Her songs were not written to fade. They were written to endure just as she endured. In this way, her music became her diary, her memory, her companion against the weight of eternity. The weight of immortality also shaped how others saw her. To some, Marceline was intimidating, untouchable, a legend who had lived longer than their kingdoms. To others, she was a curiosity, someone to admire from afar but never truly understand. Few could see past the centuries to the girl who still longed for closeness, who still feared abandonment, who still carried the grief of watching Simon fade away. To most, she was the Vampire Queen. To herself, she was still Marceline, still learning how to carry the ache of living forever. What made Marceline unique was that she did not let immortality strip her of feeling. Many who live too long grow numb, protecting themselves by detaching from the world. Marceline never allowed that to happen. She chose to keep feeling everything, even when it hurt. She chose to keep laughing, to keep crying, to keep falling in love, knowing the pain that would follow. This choice was not weakness, it was strength. It was the way she refused to let eternity turn her cold. Immortality also brought with it strange changes in perspective. While others feared the end of life, Marceline sometimes feared the endlessness of hers. The thought that time would stretch on and on without limit was not comforting but heavy. It meant she had to carry her griefs forever, with no natural ending. It meant she had to keep finding new ways to live, new reasons to sing, new loves to make the centuries meaningful. Without them, the weight could crush her. With them, she could endure. And so the story of Marceline's immortality is not about triumph, but about balance. It is about learning how to hold both joy and sorrow at once. It is about remembering again and again that love is worth the pain of loss, that music is worth the ache of memory, that laughter is worth the shadow of silence that comes after. Immortality was her burden, but it was also her canvas. From it, she created songs that reached across centuries, healing not only herself but anyone who listened. One of the quiet truths of Marceline's immortality is that she carried the memories of centuries even when no one else remembered. For her, history was not something written in books or told in stories. It was lived experience, etched into her heart. She could walk through the ruins of a forgotten city and recall the laughter that once filled its streets. She could stand beside Simon, long after he had become the Ice King, and remember the warmth he no longer knew. To her, the past was never truly gone. It lingered in her songs, in her memories, in her very presence. This gave her a perspective that others often misunderstood. When mortals argued over small disputes, Marceline sometimes withdrew, not out of apathy, but because she had seen those same arguments 100 times before. When kingdoms rose with pride, she could already imagine the day they would fall, just as others had. This foresight did not make her cynical. It made her reflective. She knew that all things passed, and yet she chose to care anyway. The weight of immortality also shaped the way Marceline lived her daily life. She rarely planned far ahead. For what was the point of planning centuries in advance when everything could change so quickly? Instead, she lived in the moment, savoring laughter, pouring her heart into songs, finding joy in fleeting connections. This way of living sometimes clashed with those around her, especially people like Princess Bubblegum, who thought in terms of structure and long-term stability. Yet for Marceline, the present was all the more precious because she had seen how fragile the future could be. Hambo, her constant companion, remained her most personal reminder of this fragility. To others, it was just a stuffed bear, old and worn. But to Marceline, it was irreplaceable. Every stitch carried memory. Every frayed edge carried comfort. When she held Hambo, she remembered the child who once clung to him in the ruins. She remembered Simon, who had kept her safe. She remembered all the moments when Hambo had been her anchor in an endless sea of time. Losing him, even briefly, was like losing a piece of herself. His return, whenever fate brought him back to her, was like finding her heart again. Her immortality meant that grief was never temporary. While mortals healed by forgetting, Marceline remembered. The people she loved lived on inside her, preserved in memory and song. This was both a comfort and a burden. She could never lose them entirely, but she could never escape them either. Each bond remained with her, carried through centuries, layered one upon another until her soul was a chorus of voices from the past. This chorus shaped her music into something timeless. When Marceline sang, it was not just about one moment or one person. It was about all of them at once. Her songs carried the weight of Simon's fading memory, the ache of friendships long gone, the laughter of loves that had healed her, and the sorrow of those who had left. To listen to her sing was to hear not just her story, but the echo of generations she had lived through. It was why her music resonated so deeply. It was not bound by one time. It was bound by all time. The loneliness of immortality could be sharp, especially in the spaces between songs. Marceline sometimes withdrew into solitude, retreating into her cave or drifting through the sky with no one beside her. These moments were not always sad, but they carried the quiet weight of someone who had lived too long to be fully understood. Few could walk with her into those silences. Few could grasp what it meant to feel the centuries pressing on your heart. And yet, despite this loneliness, she never gave up on connection. She kept seeking out friends, kept risking her heart, kept opening herself to laughter and love. This is what made her so remarkable. She could have surrendered to eternity, let it make her numb, let it turn her cold. Instead, she chose to feel everything. She chose to let her music carry both joy and sorrow, to let her bonds heal her, even as they broke her. In this way, she refused to let immortality strip her of what made her human. The weight of eternity did not vanish. It never could. But Marceline learned to carry it with grace, balancing grief with joy, loss with love, silence with song. Her immortality became less of a burden and more of a canvas, upon which she painted her story one song at a time. And in that story we see not just a vampire queen, but a soul who refused to let endless time make her less alive. There is a certain heaviness in watching centuries pass while you remain unchanged. Marceline often saw herself as a fixed point in a shifting world, like a mountain surrounded by rivers that flowed and changed with every season. The Candy Kingdom rose, the Fire Kingdom flared, the Ice Kingdom waxed and waned, yet Marceline drifted through them all, untouched by time and the way they were. She could laugh with their rulers, fight beside them, even love them. But eventually their form shifted, their kingdoms reshaped, while she stayed the same. This permanence was a gift, but it was also a wound. Her immortality also sharpened her awareness of memory. She remembered details others would forget, the way a friend's laughter sounded on a summer night, the exact hue of twilight during an adventure long ago. These memories, vivid and unyielding, clung to her like living things. For most mortals, memory softens over time, edges blur, and wounds close. For Marceline, they stayed sharp, as if they had happened yesterday. His clarity meant her joy stayed fresh, but so did her griefs. She could not outrun them. She could only sing them, shaping memory into melody so the weight became a little lighter. Her bass guitar became more than an instrument. It was her companion, a voice when silence pressed too heavy against her. Through it, she could transform centuries into sound, distill complex emotions into chords that trembled in the air. When Marceline played, she was not just passing the time. She was making sense of time itself. She was pulling meaning from eternity, reminding herself that even in a world that kept shifting, her music could give permanence to what mattered. Hambo, ever present in her story, reflected the same truth. To hold him was to feel the weight of her life condensed into something small and simple. He was her tether to innocence, her reminder that she had once been a child before the weight of eternity settled on her shoulders. Losing him was always devastating because it felt like losing a part of her identity, a piece of herself she could never replace. Yet whenever he returned to her, it was as though time folded and she could breathe again, remembering that even in an immortal life, some bonds could endure. The weight of immortality also showed in the way Marceline related to conflict. For mortals, battles and arguments often carried finality. For Marceline, they were temporary, just another verse in a longer song. This perspective sometimes made her seem careless or detached, but in truth, it came from knowing that life stretched beyond any single moment of strife. She understood that even after the harshest words, reconciliation could still follow, just as a minor chord can resolve into harmony. This patience, born of centuries, gave her a kind of wisdom that others often overlooked. Still, there were moments when the weight grew too heavy, when the endlessness of life pressed against her chest like a storm. These moments often came after loss. A friend would pass, a love would fade, and Marceline would find herself staring at the horizon, wondering how many more times she would have to endure the same ache. In those moments, it was easy to feel hollow, easy to wonder whether the gift of immortality was truly worth its cost. But each time she found her way back through music, through laughter, through the fragile connections that reminded her why she chose to keep opening her heart. The resilience she showed in these moments was not born of denial, but of acceptance. Marceline did not pretend immortality was easy. She did not hide the pain of it. Instead, she accepted it as part of her existence. And in that acceptance, she found strength. She knew she could not escape the weight, but she could carry it differently. She could carry it with songs instead of silence, with laughter instead of despair, with love instead of fear. This choice made her immortality less of a curse and more of a testament to her will to remain human at heart. Over the centuries, Marceline became a quiet historian of Oud, not by writing books or recording tales, but by embodying memory itself. She remembered what others forgot. She carried stories within her music that no one else alive could tell. She was the living bridge between the ruins of the Mushroom War and the kingdoms that rose in its wake. Without her, much of that history would be gone. Through her, it lived on, not as dusty facts, but as songs that carried feeling, weight, and humanity. And so the weight of immortality was not only her burden, but her gift to the world. By enduring, she gave continuity to a fractured land. By singing, she gave voice to what was lost. By opening her heart, she proved that eternity does not have to strip away love. It can deepen it, even when it hurts. The longer Marceline lived, the more she realized that eternity was not about endless strength, but about endless vulnerability. To remain alive through centuries meant to keep exposing herself to pain, to keep risking her heart, to keep feeling everything when it would have been easier to grow numb. That choice defined her more than her fangs, more than her powers, more than her crown. Immortality was the canvas, but her humanity was the paint. There were times when she laughed at her own condition, making light of it with jokes or teasing songs. Humor was one of her shields, a way of softening the sharp edges of her eternity. Yet beneath the humor, there was always sincerity. Each song, each joke, each playful jab carried the undertone of someone who understood how fragile life was, precisely because she had lived through so much of it. Marceline turned her immortality into art, not to escape its weight, but to make it bearable, both for herself and for those who listened. Her presence in Oud became a reminder of time's strange rhythm. To mortals she was a legend, someone who had lived through ages and battles they could scarcely imagine. To her friends she was simply Marceline, teasing, playful, emotional, and sometimes stubborn. Few realized how heavy the centuries were for her because she carried them lightly, balancing sorrow with laughter. But when she sang, when she poured herself fully into music, the truth was undeniable. The weight of her immortality flowed through every note, reaching even those who could not understand it. Symbols like Hambo made this weight visible. That worn bear, stitched and simple, was far more than an object. He was continuity. He was proof that some things could survive even when people and kingdoms did not. Every time she lost him, it was as though a part of her heart had been torn away. Every time he returned, It was as though eternity gave her back a piece of herself. To outsiders, it may have seemed childish, but for Marceline, Hambo was sacred. He was the vessel that carried her past into her present, a soft anchor in an endless sea of time. The truth of her immortality is that it made her music necessary. Without songs, the centuries would have been unbearable. Without laughter, the weight would have crushed her. Without love, she would have drifted endlessly, unmoored and cold. Music, laughter, and love were not luxuries. They were survival. They were the ways she refused to let eternity turn her into something hollow. Each performance was not only art. It was defiance. It was her saying to time, "You will not erase me. You will not make me less human." And so Marceline endured, not by resisting immortality, but by reshaping it. She chose to live fully in every moment, even when those moments would one day become memories she alone carried. She chose to keep seeking bonds even when she knew they would break. She chose to turn grief into melody, silence into song, and loneliness into something others could share. In doing so, she transformed the curse of endlessness into a gift that touched everyone around her. When we think of her standing alone in her cave, strumming her bass while the centuries stretched on, we should not see only loneliness. We should see resilience. We should see the soul of someone who chose to feel again and again, no matter how heavy it became. The weight of immortality did not crush her. It shaped her into the Marceline whose voice could carry the history of ooh in every lyric, whose songs could reach across generations, whose heart remained open despite everything. As centuries stretched behind her, Marceline's story began to turn toward resolution. The wounds of her childhood, the loneliness of her immortality, the sharp edges of her conflicts, all of these began to soften into something steadier. Her life, once defined by wandering and uncertainty, grew into a life defined by choice. She was no longer only the child of chaos, nor only the vampire queen. She became something fuller, someone who carried her past with grace and found peace in the connection she had once feared to lose. A great part of this resolution came through reconciling with her father. Hunson Abadir had always been a looming presence, both a source of power and a wound that never healed. For much of her life, Marceline struggled with what it meant to be his daughter. Was she destined to become like him, selfish and destructive, devouring everything around her? Or could she carve out her own path, carrying his legacy, but reshaping it into something new? The answer came slowly, not in sudden forgiveness, but in quiet moments of understanding. Hunson would never be the father she longed for, but he was still part of her story. By facing him with honesty, Marceline found that she did not need to erase him to move forward. She could accept the pain he caused, acknowledge the love he offered in his own broken way, and still choose to be different. This acceptance freed her. No longer weighed down by the question of who she was in his shadow, Marceline embraced who she had become. She was not defined by her father, nor by her vampirism, nor by the ruins of the Mushroom War. She was defined by her choices to sing instead of silence, to love instead of close herself off, to endure instead of fade. Her bond with Princess Bubblegum became the living proof of this growth. What once had been sharp with conflict mellowed into a partnership built on trust, patience, and vulnerability. Bubblegum stayed, and Marceline allowed herself to believe in that staying. Together, they became symbols of endurance, of love that survives centuries of misunderstanding. For Marceline, this was resolution, not in words, but in presence. To stand beside someone after everything, to still laugh, still sing, still argue, and forgive that was the clearest sign that she had grown beyond the loneliness of her youth. Her music, too, reached a new stage. It was no longer only the voice of pain or loss. It became a celebration of her journey, a reflection of all she had carried and transformed. Her songs still held sorrow, still echoed with longing, but they also carried joy, humor, and tenderness. Through music, she shared her story not as tragedy, but as testament. Each note said, "I have endured and I have chosen to keep loving." Marceline's legacy is not one of conquest or rule. Unlike kings or queens who built empires, her mark on Ooo was quieter but no less lasting. She was the bridge between the world before the Mushroom War and the strange magical kingdoms that came after. Through her, memory survived. Through her songs, the history of ruin and resilience lived on, not as cold facts, but as living emotions that others could feel. She was Oo's heart, its melody, its reminder that love and pain are inseparable, and that both are worth carrying. Her resolution was not the end of her story, but the acceptance of it. She no longer needed to prove herself against her father, against her past, or against time. She had already done so simply by surviving and singing. The Vampire Queen was not a monster, nor only a legend. She was Marceline's daughter, friend, lover, singer, and witness to a world that kept changing around her. As we begin this final segment, we see Marceline not as the lonely child clutching Hambo, nor as the fierce warrior defeating vampires, but as the woman who has learned to hold all those versions of herself together. She is resolution in human form, a soul who has carried grief into love, loneliness into song, and immortality into something beautiful. Resolution for Marceline did not come as a sudden revelation. It arrived slowly, in the quiet moments that others might overlook. It was in the way she could sit with bubblegum in silence and feel no need to fill it with words. It was in the way she could return to old places filled with memories and no longer feel only grief, but also gratitude for the life she had lived. It was in the way her songs began to carry warmth alongside sorrow, as if she had finally found a balance between the two. One of the clearest signs of this resolution came in her relationship with Simon. For centuries, she had carried the pain of watching him slip away, of seeing the guardian of her childhood become the Ice King. But in time, she came to understand that even in his fractured state, the man she loved was still there, hidden behind the ice. Her love for Simon became less about longing for what was lost and more about honoring what remained. Even when he did not remember her, she remembered him. Even when his mind was clouded, she carried the clarity for both of them. And when glimpses of his old self broke through, they were enough. Enough to remind her that love, even altered, never fully dies. Her reconciliation with Simon was not about fixing what could not be fixed. It was about acceptance. It was about realizing that their bond had already shaped her, that his kindness had given her strength in a world that had none, and that carrying him in her heart was enough to honor that gift. By shifting from grief to gratitude, Marceline freed herself from the sharpest edges of her pain. This sense of peace seeped into all areas of her life. Marceline no longer lived only in the shadow of the past, nor in the weight of eternity. She began to live in the present with a fullness that had once seemed impossible. Her immortality no longer felt like a burden pressing her down. Instead, it became a vast space in which she could continue to grow, to sing, to love. Her friendships reflected this change. Where once she had tested people, pushing them away to see if they would return, she now allowed them to stay without condition. She no longer needed proof. She trusted in their presence. This made her bonds gentler, steadier, and more joyful. The walls she had built to protect herself began to fall, brick by brick, replaced by laughter, trust, and quiet comfort. Her music, too, evolved into something more hopeful. The sorrow was still there because sorrow never leaves completely, but it was softened by joy. She could sing of grief and love in the same breath, weaving them together instead of holding them apart. Her songs became celebrations of the whole of her life, the darkness and the light, the loneliness and the connection. This wholeness gave her music a power beyond any single note. It carried the weight of centuries, but also the beauty of someone who had learned to carry them gracefully. Marceline's legacy lies not only in her survival, but in her transformation. She showed that immortality need not make one cold or distant. It could make one warmer, deeper, more compassionate. She showed that love, even when it breaks, is always worth choosing. She showed that music could hold centuries of memory, turning pain into something beautiful. Through her, U learned that the truest strength lies not in power or fear, but in vulnerability and song. In the later years of her story, we see Marceline with more ease in herself. The child who once wandered alone with Hambo had grown into someone who could share her life openly, someone who had found love with the bubblegum, reconciliation with Simon, and peace with her past. This was not the end of her story, for immortality means her journey will always continue, but it was resolution enough to make her steps lighter, her songs brighter, her heart less burdened. Her legacy will always echo in the land of U, not as a tale of conquest, but as a melody carried through the air. The girl who survived the ruins, the queen who faced the vampires, the immortal who chose to keep loving, all of these pieces remain in her story. And for those who listen closely, they remain in her songs, each one a reminder that the truest resolution is not forgetting the past, but weaving it into the present with grace. Resolution for Marceline was never about erasing pain. It was about learning to hold it alongside joy. She carried both equally, never denying one for the other. This is what gave her such depth, what made her music resonate with anyone who listened. It was the honesty of someone who had lived too long to pretend that life was only happiness, but who had also loved too deeply to pretend it was only sorrow. Her legacy was this honesty, the rare ability to show both sides of the heart at once. Her bond with Bubblegum became the clearest testament to this. Where once their story was filled with tension and unspoken feelings, it grew into one of quiet partnership. They no longer needed to prove themselves to one another. They no longer needed to fight for recognition. They had already done that work, and what remained was steadiness. For Marceline, that steadiness was a new kind of peace. She could love without fear of abandonment, and she could sing without the sharp edge of doubt. Their laughter together was softer, fuller, carrying the sound of two people who had finally arrived where they were always meant to be. This peace extended beyond her relationships. Marceline herself became a figure of comfort in U, not just a legend to be feared or admired, but a presence that grounded others. Her centuries of experience gave her wisdom, but it was her vulnerability that gave her power. Friends sought her out, not because she had all the answers, but because she understood. She could listen, empathize, and share her songs as offerings of solace. In this way, she became a quiet guardian of the land, not by ruling, but by being present. Her reconciliation with Simon deepened this role. Though his mind was fractured, Marceline's acceptance of him became a lesson itself. It showed that love can endure even when it changes shape, even when memory fades. Their story, once filled with grief, became a story of enduring connection. Marceline never stopped remembering for both of them, and in doing so, She kept Simon alive in ways he could not keep himself. This act of remembrance was her gift, and not only to him, but to Oo. Through her, the history of the Ice King carried humanity it might otherwise have lost. The symbol of Hambo continued to thread through her life as well. Though simple, he remained the quiet anchor of her story. In keeping him close, Marceline showed that the smallest things can carry the largest meanings. Hambo was proof that love and memory survive, even when the world changes beyond recognition. He was the child's comfort that became the immortal's relic, and his presence reminded everyone that even in endless time, innocence can be preserved. Marceline's legacy lies most profoundly in her music. Long after kingdoms crumble, long after rulers fade, songs endure. They carry feelings across generations, reaching hearts that the singer may never meet. Marceline understood this better than anyone. Her songs were her gift to the world, fragments of herself offered to anyone who needed them. They carried the truth of immortality, the ache of loss, the beauty of love, the relief of laughter. They carried the story of Oo not as history, but as melody, making it alive for all who listened. Her resolution, then, was not about finding a final end. For someone immortal, there is no ending. It was about finding balance, finding a way to live with peace in the midst of eternity. By embracing her past, loving in her present, and singing for the future, Marceline created a life that was not defined by loss, but by transformation. She did not escape the weight of her story. She carried it, reshaped it, and offered it back to the world as song. In the stillness of night, when her voice drifted over the land, those who heard it felt more than music. They felt the centuries behind her. They felt the pain and the joy, the sorrow and the laughter, all woven into melody. And in that feeling, they found comfort. They found themselves reflected in her immortal voice. This was Marceline's truest legacy, to make others feel less alone, even when she herself had carried so much loneliness. As the story of Marceline comes into its final movement, we see a woman who has walked through ruin and love, through silence and song, through centuries of loneliness and moments of deep connection. She has carried the scars of childhood, the weight of immortality, the ache of broken bonds, and the joy of healed ones. And yet, through it all, she has remained herself. Not unchanged, for she grew and shifted with every century, but true to the girl who sang to soothe her fears, true to the queen who chose love over hunger, true to the woman who kept opening her heart no matter how many times it was hurt. Her resolution is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of peace within it. She still carries grief for Simon, but she also carries gratitude. She still remembers the chaos of her father, but she has chosen her own path. She still feels the pull of immortality's weight, but she has learned to balance it with song. Resolution, for Marceline, is not forgetting the pain, but weaving it into something beautiful. It is the understanding that love and loss are not opposites, but companions, walking beside one another through the centuries. Her legacy, like her music, does not belong only to her. It belongs to Oo, to the friends who laughed with her, to the lovers who chose her, to the people who heard her songs and felt a piece of themselves reflected within them. She is remembered not as a conqueror, not as a ruler, but as a singer, a witness, and a heart that beat through eternity. Her legacy is love turned into melody, grief turned into tenderness, immortality turned into humanity. Marceline's story is a reminder that even in a world built on ruins, healing is possible. That even after centuries of silence, songs can still rise. That even when bonds break, love can return in new forms. Her life is proof that immortality need not be a prison. It can be a stage upon which love plays again and again, each time more resonant than the last. When we think of her now, we see not only the Vampire Queen, not only the immortal witness, but the woman who strummed her bass and poured centuries into sound. We see her laughing with Bubblegum, reconciling with Simon, holding Hambo close. We see her floating through the night sky, her hair drifting like smoke, her voice carrying softly into the stars, and we hear her music, the eternal thread that ties her past, present, and future into something whole. Her story is one of survival, yes, but also of transformation, of choosing again and again to keep loving in the face of loss, of choosing to keep singing in the face of silence, of choosing to remain tender, even when eternity offered her every reason to grow cold. Marceline's resolution is not just her own. It is a gift to everyone who has ever loved, ever lost, ever felt the ache of memory. She shows us that the heart endures, not in spite of pain, but through it. And so, as we close this long, quiet journey through her life, we hold Marceline's story like one of her songs, a song of grief and joy, of silence and melody, of chaos and love. A song that never truly ends because it echoes forward into every heart that listens. Her legacy is not only that she lived, but that she sang, and in singing, she reminded the world that even immortality can be deeply, achingly human. Good night.